Bungie was back this week with their This Week at Bungie on the 18th of November 2021, and they gave us a massive update about the abilities and supers and loads of Sandbox changes coming in the December patch alongside the 30th anniversary. So the TWAB is huge this week, so I'm just going to dive straight in as we got quite a lot to get through. So Bungie say hello and welcome to another Sandbox focused TWAB. And if you're new around these parts, you may be asking, what is a Sandbox? Well, it's complicated. It's split between the weapons that you use, the armour that you equip, and the perks and mods that you hunt for, and the enemies that you face. And let's be real, the Destiny 2 Sandbox is broad. Last week we focused on the weapons sandbox and what changes we had planned for the 7th of December. Well, this week we're taking a pass on the abilities that your Guardian possesses. So think supers, melees, grenades, and class abilities. So I highly recommend you grab a glass of water and maybe even a snack, because we've got a pretty lengthy update for you. Well, before we dive into the details, it's customary to have a TWAB intro discussing what's going on in the realm of Bungie and Destiny. So let's keep this short and sweet, shall we? So our 30th anniversary is out on December the 7th, which just so happens to be 19 days from the publication of this blog article. And in-game, there's still plenty to do between the seasonal challenges, Trials of Osiris, the occasional Iron Banner, vendor reputation, Godroll hunting, and more. Well, next Thursday is Thanksgiving here in the United States, and many of us are going to be taking some time to rest up and spend time with the family. So as such, expect a very light TWAB next Wednesday. Alright, Sandbox time, let's get to it. There's buffs, there's nerfs, there's tuning levers that we've recently unlocked with back-end changes, and there's clear separations for PvE and PvP and more too. So there's a lot going on here, so don't feel bad if you scratch your head wondering how these upcoming changes will feel. If you find anything a bit confusing, please sound off with questions. Now we're going to clarify on our forums and social spaces. So with all that preamble out of the way, I'm going to finally shut up and pass the mic over to the team. Well, first of all, we've got new legends will rise. So hail, Kevin Yanis is here to give you a quick intro before I hand off to fellow designers Eric Smith and Mike Humboldt. So a few TWABs ago, I gave a brief roadmap leading towards our 30th anniversary, the Witch Queen and beyond. And a new roadmap update will likely not happen for some time after this, as the team is heads down on more than a few initiatives. So one of the initiatives you're going to hear about today is an adjustment to ability regeneration as a whole, and a refocusing on the Crucible gameplay on weapons. The team has touched almost every piece of ability content with this release, and I'm fairly convinced this is going to be our biggest balance patch ever. So earlier this year we heard overwhelming feedback that the Crucible has been largely dominated by ability usage. Players felt that abilities were firing off too frequently, with too much potency and too little investment. So at its core, Destiny is a game about space magic, so any adjustments to our abilities must be made with care. We believe that the changes we've made will keep the heart of what makes Destiny abilities fun intact, while shaving down some of the excessive cases that we've seen out there. I feel it's important to reinforce here that part of Destiny's strength is that it's a live game, and we're able to iterate and improve the game as time goes on. This means that we're building a new foundational system, like the one that you're going to hear about today, with that in mind, and we're giving ourselves more balancing knobs to tune than we've ever had before, and we hope you'll start to see why that's so important as you hear this update. So we hope the 30th anniversary shakes up the Sandbox in new ways and gets you excited for even more changes coming in the Witch Queen. The team will likely go heads down for a bit, as we've still got Solar and Arc 3.0ify alongside other insanely cool initiatives. So the team takes feedback very seriously, and as Destiny players ourselves, we have an intrinsic fire to keep improving things for everyone. We hope what you've seen over the last year reinforces that this team is both about competitive balance and making incredibly dope new stuff. Well, okay, I'm now going to fade away into the ether as Eric Smith takes us into what's coming next. Well, next up we got the winds of change, so Eric takes over and says, so in the 30th anniversary we've changed the way ability cooldowns work. Up until now, cooldowns across the individual ability types, so grenade, melee, class, super, they've generally been identical between all abilities of the same type. For example, all the grenades in today's Destiny 2 share the same cooldown time, with the exception of stasis grenades. This shared cooldown means that all grenades need to have roughly the same power output because they have the same time cost. Well, for the 30th anniversary, we've made a change that allows us to tune the cooldown of each ability separately. This gives us a new knob to turn when balancing abilities that are too powerful or not powerful enough. Well, now that we've got this new system in place, we've done a cooldown tuning pass on all the subclass abilities in the game, tuning each ability cooldown time against its power output. We've also tuned ability power outputs and assigned cooldown times accordingly. The best example of this might be the Flux Grenade, so let's take a look. So in terms of the Flux Grenade, you've increased the base cooldown from 82 seconds to 182 seconds, increased the attached detonation from 150 to 250, so that is a one-shot kill in PvP, and increased the damage versus PvE combatants by 15% on top of the base damage increase, and removed the projectile tracking, added a small amount of aim assist, and increased the throw speed by 117%, and now it sticks to all surfaces. As you can see, the Flux Grenade now has a very long cooldown, but it's a one-shot kill in PvP if you manage to land it. It also hits harder in PvE, and as a reminder, the Flux Grenade is currently only available to Hunter Arcstriders. Well, now here's an example in the opposite direction, so the Firebolt Grenade. So Firebolt Grenade reduces base cooldown from 82 seconds to 64 seconds, reduce the damage per bolt from 90 to 65, and increase damage versus PvE combatants by 15%. So the Firebolt Grenade has a low cooldown time, especially at tier 10 discipline, and it also has a low damage output. So these kind of varied cooldowns and power outputs should make the game feel more dynamic and give more depth to build crafting. So to make build crafting around cooldowns easier, you're now going to be able to see the base cooldown time of your abilities when selecting them on the subclass screen. On the character screen, you'll be able to see the actual cooldown time of your abilities as they're affected by your equipped ability and also the armor stats too. And a couple of things to note about cooldown times in the UI. The base cooldown time is actually the cooldown time at tier 3 of the relevant armor stat, so strength and discipline, etc. This is because the system technically penalises you from tanking your stats below tier 3, in which case your cooldown would be longer than the base, so we're looking at updating this to be more intuitive in a future release. Cooldown times for the class abilities not currently displayed due to a technical issue. We plan to fix this in a future release. So we've been calling this the Variable Ability Cooldown System, and we think it's the beginning of a big change for the Destiny 2 sandbox. It's a foundational change in preparation to move the light subclasses over to the subclass 3.0 system that Stasis currently uses, and for the 30th anniversary, we're using it to change the cooldown of nearly every ability in the game. One of our design goals this year was to reduce the amount of ability spam in the Crucible and to put focus back on gunplay, so to this end, we've made ability cooldown times longer on average than they've ever been before, so we don't want the PvE experience to suffer for the sake of PvP balance though, so we've tried to compensate where possible. For example, we've increased all grenade damage versus PvE combatants by 15% or more, and this should make grenades feel like a bigger power moment than they do in today's game. So melee ability cooldowns haven't been increased quite as much as the grenade cooldowns, and some of the less aggressive melee attacks have lower cooldowns than before. And class ability cooldowns also have generally increased, but the changes vary depending on which ability is equipped. So we are excited to see how these changes feel once they hit the live game, and we will be monitoring and adjusting accordingly in future releases. So now we're going to pass the mic to Mike Humboldt and talk about the big changes to Super Cooldown. Well, next up we've got Into the Fray, and Mike starts here. So he says, since Destiny's launch in 2014, super energy gain has almost been entirely passive. So your intellect stat dictates how quickly your super regenerates, with a few other elements like orbs of power, armor, weapon perks and defeating targets as active sources. This system worked well for a long time, but has had issues that grow more obvious as the game has evolved and overall player skill, especially skill in evaluating how to play around their character build, has increased. So for example, in a high stakes game mode like Trials of Osiris or Survival, where each life is precious, passive play becomes more common as players sit back and wait for their supers to close out a tied game. In general, we want the most effective way to gain super energy to be actively engaging in combat, and that doesn't mean you need to win every fight, but we want you to try. To get us closer to that goal, we're making a big change to the system. So super regeneration will still have a passive component scaled by your intellect stat, but at a significantly reduced rate. So on top of your passive regeneration, you will also gain super energy by dealing and taking damage to or from opponents. So here are a few key goals of this new system. So in PvE, super uptime should be relatively unchanged from the live game, if not slightly higher. We're pretty happy with the frequency of supers in most PvE content, and don't want to make big changes right now on that front. So everyone should get at least one super in a 6v6 match that goes to score or time limit as long as they engage in regular combat. So expression of power through using your awesome space magic is a core part of what makes Destiny special, and we're not looking to change that. We think that the cadence of supers in 6v6 modes is slightly too high, but we don't expect a drastic change in super uptime for most players in playlists like Control or Iron Banner as a result of those changes. So supers should be less frequent in 3v3 modes than in the live game, where 2 supers per match is a fairly regular occurrence. These modes are about expression of player skill. You want that skill to be primarily about team coordination, positioning, intelligent use of your abilities, and first and foremost, gunplay. While there is an absolute skill in outmaneuvering active supers or playing around the super uptime, supers in general are purposefully designed to be accessible power fantasies for all players that inherently create asymmetry that we need to account for in a more competitive play. Primary weapon play should also have a noticeable benefit in super energy regeneration. So with this new system, we are scaling energy gains up and down granularly based on the source of the damage, both outgoing and incoming. So outgoing primary weapon damage is significantly higher return of super energy per damage point than any other type of damage. And different supers should come online at different times in a given match, and your super of choice should have impact on how quickly it regenerates. To reiterate what we mentioned before, we've always lived in a world where nearly every super in the game shares the same cooldown, regardless of their efficiency in a given game mode, and now we've made the foundational change to differentiate the cooldowns per individual ability. We want to address the super o'clock issue in Crucible, where 3 minutes into a match 12 supers are simultaneously popped and chaos ensues. We also want to open up the build crafting space where your super's cooldown time is an important element in your decision making beyond how high you want your intellect stat to be. To that end, we've separated supers into cooldown tiers that affect both the passive regeneration rate as well as the damage-based regeneration rate as well. So this tiering was primarily influenced by each super's kill potential, where most one-off supers are unlikely to wipe a team or a room of combatants, but long-lasting roaming super should have a trade-off as a result. So we've taken into account the general potency of the subclass kits where possible. So for example, later on we're going to discuss Shatter Dive and changes we're making to impact how effective the Revenant Hunter is in the neutral game, causing us to shift some of that potency to the super's uptime as a result. It's also important to stress that this is the first iteration of the system, where any given super will fall into the recharge rate tiers, and it will change over time as we continue tuning. So these are the super regeneration rate tiers that we're launching on December the 7th. So we've got tier 5, and that is the fastest regeneration. There's only one, it's Well of Radiance. Tier 4 is Blade Barrage and Silence and Squall. Tier 3 is Shadow Shot, Burning Maul, Arc Staff, Nova Bomb and Thunder Crash. Tier 2 is Golden Gun, Chaos Reach, Nova Warp, Storm Trance, Daybreak, Sentinel Shield, and Tier 1, that is the slowest regeneration. There's Spectral Blades, Fist of Havoc, Hammer of Soul, Glacial Quake, and Winter's Wrath. So as Kevin and Eric mentioned, this sets up a future where we want to move towards subclass 3.0, and as an example for the 30th anniversary, things like Deadfall and Mobius Quiver variants of Shadow Shot will share the same cooldown tier, but with the Void 3.0 launch in February, they could exist in different tiers based on their potency. So by that same token, Ward of Dawn, which is currently tied to Sentinel Shield's cooldown, will be moved to the Tier 5 group as a standalone super with Void 3.0. Well, next up we got Taking It Down a Notch, and Mike goes on. So let's talk about non-super abilities for a moment. So in the 27th of May 2021 TWAB, Kevin shared our foundational pillars for the role we want abilities to play in PvP Combat Sandbox. As a quick refresher, this is where we want to be. So weapons are the primary way players engage with combat. Non-super abilities accentuate or augment the combat, but should rarely solve an encounter by themselves. Abilities have clear strengths, weaknesses and counterplay, and build crafting is rewarding within the moment-to-moment combat loop of Destiny. We're not there yet. In general, ability uptime in the Crucible is too high for their current potency, and it's difficult to understand when an opponent will regain an ability after using it. Some of that uptime comes from passive cooldowns, but many of our outliers also come from elements of the build crafting system that have previously been unified in ability energy returns between PvE and PvP. So with the 30th anniversary, we've taken a pass at a significant number of these elements. So across subclass perks, armor mods, and exotic armor pieces, we've tuned PvP energy regeneration separately from their base PvE values, which we are not changing. So that's really interesting there. They are separating the PvP and the PvE sandbox even more than they've ever done before. So per our pillars, we want build crafting to be rewarding, but in its current state, the combination nature of these perks and items leads to an unsustainable ability energy economy that diminishes weapon play in PvP. So for this tuning pass, we're focused primarily on items that feed into the self-perpetuating loops of ability energy gains. So here is a brief list of the affected items. So we've got these subclass neutral game perks. So these perks have had their ability energy regeneration reduced by roughly 50% in PvP, and we've targeted perks that can either activate out of combat with a single button press, or those that were returning amounts of ability energy that were significantly out of band. So we've got the Whisper of Shards, the Arc Web, Rising Storm, Ionic Traces, Electrostatic Surge, Aftershocks, Inertia Override, Benevolent Dawn, Practice Makes Perfect, and Dark Matter. Next up we got the subclass in super perks. So these perks scale down energy returns as you get kills in your super. For example, the first kill while in the super returns more super energy than the third kill. So these perks often result in supers being able to roam the map for much longer than is healthy for the game, and mean that a victim can frequently die to an active super, respawn on the other side of the map and be killed by that very same super again. So we've rescaled this energy refund decay more aggressively in PvP, so that the minimum energy refund is reached roughly twice as quickly. So no change has been made to the refund decay against PvE combatants. This includes Everlasting Fire and Trample, and then next up we've got Exotic Armour. So each exotic below has a custom tuning pass focused on their ability energy return in PvP. So with the Frosties, so stacks no longer multiply in PvP with other regeneration buffs, and it is now an additive scaler. So no changes in PvE. With the Heart of Inmost Light ability energy regeneration scalers reduced by 50% in PvP, and reworked so activating multiple abilities will now reliably result in multiple empowered stacks. Stacking behaviour was previously a bug, but it seemed like a good opportunity to promote it as a feature. Next up we got Controverse Hold, so the duration of the grenade regeneration buff is no longer random between 1 and 4 seconds, and now has a fixed duration of 1.75 seconds. And reduce the grenade energy regeneration scaler by 50% in PvP. And the previous average duration due to waiting was 1.71 seconds, with a 1 second duration being most common, so this should improve the exotic's consistency across the game with a lower return in PvP. The Doomfang Pauldrons reduce the super energy gain on activation when an opposing player is killed by a void melee by 50%, no change in PvE. And also Shinobu's Vow, so reduce the grenade energy gain on its versus hit players by 66%. Again, no change in PvE. Actually, all of these have no change in PvE. And then next I've got Crown of Tempest, grenade, melee and super energy regeneration scaler buff. Duration reduced from 7 seconds to 4 seconds in PvP. And then finally, the Stag, so reduce the class ability energy refund and shield break by 50% in PvP. Well, next up we got Armour mod. So in general, we've reduced energy returns from these mods by roughly 50% in PvP, depending on the number of copies that the mod you have slotted. This includes melee kickstart, grenade kickstart, utility kickstart, perpetuation, bolstering detonation, focusing strike, bomber, outreach, dynamo, distribution, momentum transfer, and impact induction. So this is a big foundational shift for us, and we expect to do a lot of tuning as time goes on. So as always, we'll be on the lookout for how things are feeling across the game, and we will adjust accordingly. Now, I'm going to throw it back over to Eric for some spicy details on some more ability tuning, so you know what to expect with the 30th anniversary. Well, next up we've got Dan, this is long, and Eric comes on to say, in case you haven't caught on yet, the list of ability changes we're making in the 30th anniversary is massive. We've touched on nearly every ability in the game in some way, and we won't go over the full patch notes because it's mind-numbingly long, but let's take a look at some of the more proactive balance changes. So first of all, we've got Stasis Crystals. So Stasis Crystals do a lot. So on top of freezing players when they're created, they also block line of sight, block movement, and act as explosive barrels. Now it's all a bit too much for PvP, so with this release, Stasis Crystals will now slow players instead of freezing them, and they'll do much less damage to players when they detonate. As far as PvE is concerned, Stasis Crystals will still freeze combatants. We've increased the Stasis Crystal detonation damage versus PvE combatants. So looking at the numbers, it was almost always better to shoot directly at a combatant instead of a crystal near a combatant. And this change should help crystals better live out their explosive barrel dreams. So we've got the changes to Stasis Crystals. So while forming, Stasis Crystals now slow nearby players instead of freezing them, and they still freeze PvE combatants while forming. Increase the slow freeze radius while forming from 1.75 meters to 2.6 meters, and reduce the crystal detonation damage versus players by 55%, but increase the detonation damage versus PvE combatants by 60%. So that is going to be a massive motivation to shoot those Stasis Crystals when the 30th anniversary comes out on December the 7th. And finally, increase the crystal detonation radius from 6 meters to 8 meters. Well, next up, we're going to go over the specific classes and subclasses. So first of all, we've got the Hunter, and we're going to go over the dodge stuff first. So in order to meet our goal of less ability spam in the Crucible, we're reducing how often Hunters can dodge. So Gambler's Dodge is getting hit the hardest here because it can completely circumvent melee ability cooldown times. It also completely changes the Hunter silhouette in PvP, making it very, very powerful. So in addition, Hunter dodges will no longer break projectile tracking, meaning it's less of a get out of jail free card when a tracking rocket or another slow moving projectile is flying towards you. So with the Hunter dodge, no longer breaks projectile tracking. Marksman's dodge, so tier 10 mobility cooldown increased from 11 seconds to 14 seconds, and the base cooldown unchanged at 29 seconds. So with Gambler's dodge, tier 10 mobility cooldown increased from 14 seconds to 18 seconds, and the base cooldown duration from 29 seconds to 38 seconds. So wow, that has been hit quite hard. Next up, we've got the Revenant Hunter. So you guessed it, the Stasis Crystal changes detailed earlier mean that the Revenant Hunter's Shatter Dive will now almost never kill a full health Guardian, and Shatter Dive may still kill if the Hunter is using the Whisper of Fissures, Touch of Winter, and the target is at the very centre of all 6 crystals, but that has been incredibly rare in our playtesting. I think we can all agree that Shatter Dive was too powerful. We tried a number of fixes over the past few releases, but the truth is, as long as Stasis Crystals froze players and Shatter Dive shattered players, it was always going to be too good. But it's not all rain clouds and puddles for Shatter Dive Hunters. The increase in Stasis Crystal damage versus PvE combatants makes Shatter Dive a great choice in PvE. On top of that, we're increasing the Shatter Dive damage versus frozen combatants by 100%, so have fun melting frozen monsters. So looking at Shatter Dive more closely, much less lethal versus players due to Stasis Crystal changes, and much more lethal versus combatants due to Stasis Crystal changes, and increase the shatter damage versus frozen PvE combatants by 100%. And the Grim Harvest aspect increased fragment slots from 2 to 3. Well, next up, we got the Top Tree Arc Strider. These changes to the combination blow melee was made possible by our variable ability cooldown system. So previously, Top Tree Arc Striders were basically required to use Gambler's Dodge with this tree. We hope this change will make the ability viable even if you're using Marksman's Dodge. So with the combination blow, reduce the base cooldown duration from 96 seconds to 15 seconds. Wow, that is a massive, massive reduction. And then we've got the Bottom Tree Night Stalker. So the Vanishing Smoke melee has low damage output but high utility. And our data shows that this subclass tree is struggling in PvP, so we've decided to increase how often Pathfinder Hunters can go invisible. So Vanishing Smoke melee reduced the base cooldown from 96 seconds to 75 seconds. Well, that's all the Hunter changes. Next up, we got the Titans. So with shoulder charges, they're up first. So in our effort to put the emphasis back on gunplay in the Crucible, we've decided to reduce the number of abilities that can one-shot a full health Guardian, so the Titans shoulder charge are no longer one-shot abilities in PvP. To balance this out, we've made these shoulder charges quicker to activate, easier to hit with, and travel farther. We've also increased the damage output in PvE, so in our experience they're still powerful in PvP, in combination with short-range weapons, and when used as a movement tool. So we wanted to curb shoulder charges' potency now that we've tuned down shotguns as their current counter. So we will be monitoring the data and feedback and adjusting accordingly. So with all shoulder charges no longer one-shots players, and sprint activation time reduced from 1.5 seconds to 1.25 seconds, increase the range from 5.5 to 6.8 meters, and targeting cone increased width by about 10%, and increase the damage versus PvE combatants by 25%. So next up with Seismic Strike, this is Arc Shoulder Charge, so reduced AoE damage from 90 to 40. Now blinds enemies in the area on hit, and increase the base cooldown from 82 seconds to 90 seconds. Next up we've got Shield Bash, so that's a Void Shoulder Charge. Reduce the AoE damage from 90 to 40, and increase the base cooldown from 82 to 90. And with the Hammer Strike, that is the Solar Shoulder Charge, reduce the direct impact damage from 170 to 120. And increase the base cooldown from 82 to 90 seconds. Well, next up we've got the Barricade, so even with the rally barricade changes we made in Season of the Lost, using this ability during a fight is still a risky proposition. So we spaced out the cooldowns on the two barricades to make the choice slightly more interesting. So with Towering Barricade, increase the base cooldown duration from 37 seconds to 40 seconds, and with Rally Barricade, reduce the base cooldown duration from 37 seconds to 32 seconds. So next up we got the Behemoth. We agree that in general, the community feedback is that the Behemoth could use some love in PvE. We're hoping that these changes to Diamond Lance make this aspect a top tier PvE pick. Shiver Strike is getting a big damage buff during the Glacial Quake Super, and the Whisper of Change Fragment buff here is also very spicy and should help the Behemoth survivability in pinnacle PvE activities. And Whisper of Chains can be used by all Stasis subclasses, but making crystals is kind of the Behemoth's thing, so we're listing it here. So with the Diamond Lance, increase the fragment slots from 1 to 3, and now spawns a Diamond Lance upon killing a PvE combatant with a stasis weapon, killing 3 players with a stasis weapon in a single life, and killing an enemy with a stasis ability, and shattering an enemy. Then we got the Shiver Strike, increase the Shiver Strike damage while in Glacial Quake by 50%, and the Whisper of Chains to increase the damage resistance of PvE combatants from 25 to 40%. Well, finally with the Titans, we've got the Bottom Tree Striker. So this class is absolutely dominating PvP this season, so we're tuning it down a notch. So the changes we've made to the Fist of Havoc in Season of the Lost help the top tree as intended, but they also tune the bottom tree into a monster. So on top of that, the stasis nerfs and the other changes we've made over the past few releases created a power vacuum that Striker Bot filled with extreme prejudice. You know, we hope these changes put Striker Bot back into the pack instead of towering high above everything else. So with the tuning, we've got knockouts, a melee lunge range and melee damage bonus now deactivate after a melee kill, and trample, so super energy gain from the Fist of Havoc. Light attack now decays to a minimum amount over 3 PvP kills, down from 7, and with the frontal assault melee, so increase the base cooldown from 82 seconds to 106 seconds, and finally the Fist of Havoc, heavy slam radius reduced from 8 meters to 6 meters, and that is bottom tree only. Well, finally, we've got the changes to Warlocks, so we've got the uncharged melee first, so Warlocks have been losing slap fights for too long. So yes, up until now, Warlocks haven't been able to melee back-to-back as quickly as Titans and Hunters. No more, so with the 30th anniversary, Warlocks will be able to melee just as quickly as Titans and Hunters, and we are removing the 1 meter range extension from Warlocks receive to compensate. So we still think the idea of having each class having unique abilities to their melee is interesting, but we want to do it in a way that won't cause one class to consistently lose the slap fights, maybe someday in the future. So with the uncharged melee, so reduce the melee range from 5.5 meters to 4.5 meters, and now that matches the Hunter and the Titan, and reduce the suppression time after a melee, so you can now melee back to back at the same speed as a Hunter and a Titan. Well, next up we got the Middle Tree Void Walker, so in our effort to do away with one-shot abilities that are frustrating to be hit by, Handheld Supernova is also getting the shoulder charge treatment. That's right, Handheld Supernova will no longer be able to one-shot in PvP, and to compensate it now travels farther and pushes enemies back. We also increased the damage of Handheld Supernova and Nova Warp versus champion and boss combatants, and we had increased their damage in Season of the Lost, but we felt like it could use even more juice. So with the Handheld Supernova, reduce the damage versus players, now deals 150 damage max, increase the damage versus champions and bosses by 30%, and increase the projectile range from 12 meters to 14 meters, and pushes back the targets away from the Warlock on detonation. So with the Nova Warp, increase the damage versus champions and bosses by 30%. Well, next up we got the Shade Binder, so we feel the Shade Binder is in a pretty good place with a couple of exceptions. So 1, Winter's Wrath is still the best super for shutting down other supers, and it's not even close. So Winter's Wrath must now freeze and shatter other supers twice to kill them. So as a general rule, roaming supers shouldn't be able to one-shot other supers, and 2, the Penumbral Blast melee is too difficult to land against PvE combatants. Now when we made the ability harder to land in PvP, it had a negative effect on the PvE experience. So we've increased the proximity detonation radius against PvE combatants to make it easier to land. So all 3 stasis grenades now have different cooldown times, so we've made a change to the Bleak Watcher to avoid a situation where it was always best to use the grenade with the shortest cooldown time. So this results in an overall cooldown increase for the Bleak Watcher, which fits its incredibly high power output. So looking at the changes, with Winter's Wrath, we've got the reduced shatter pulse damage versus enemy supers, and must now generally freeze and shatter all supers twice to eliminate. So with Penumbral Blast, increase the proximity detonation radius versus PvE combatants by 100%, and Bleak Watcher, while the Bleak Watcher is equipped, all stasis grenades charge at the Glacier grenade rate. Well, finally, we've got that's all for now, folks. Eric says, okay, I think we've covered all the big stuff. And there's a bunch of other small changes coming in the 30th anniversary, but we'll cover everything else in the official patch notes. As you can see, the team has been hard at work adjusting the sandbox globally, and we hope the picture we're painting here reinforces the statements we've made in the past that the sandbox is going to evolve alongside the game. As we hit year 5 and beyond, this statement will become even more true, with new and exciting changes coming with Subclass 3.0. Stay tuned to the patch notes when the 30th anniversary goes live on December the 7th, and that is it from Bungie and the team. Well, that was a huge This Week at Bungie update, and thank you very much for staying with me. I know that's a lot of information there. There's loads of changes, so abilities, cooldown timers, supers, going through each class and subclass. So loads of information there, and I hope you found that useful. But let me know down in the comments what you think of the changes, and as always, thank you so much for watching. For more Destiny 2 content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to This Week in Video Games. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you really soon.